We hear a lot of perspectives on the Mankind podcast. Inclusion of a guest is not an endorsement of their views, and the opinions expressed here do not always represent the mission or values of the Mankind Project USA.
What happens when men grow up without village? What happens when old maps of masculinity just stop working, but we still are aching for belonging and meaning and initiation? Today's conversation goes right into the heart of those questions. My guest is MacKenzie. He's the founder of the Mythic Masculine podcast. He's a filmmaker, he's a writer, and he's someone who has spent years tracing the deeper currents shaping men, culture, and community. A dude right up my alley. Ian's work lives at the crossroads of myth, ritual, men's work, and cultural exploration. He's explored everything from Burning Man to Occupy Wall Street to ancestral story, rites of passage, and the question of what modern men actually hunger for. In our conversation today, we talk about the mythopoetic men's movement, the loss of village as kind of a verb, the rise of the manosphere, and why so many men are longing for something deeper than performance, success, or domination. We explore what happens when masculinity itself becomes a survival strategy instead of something life-giving and whole-making, and what becomes possible when men are invited into something more human, more relational, and more alive. Ian brings a depth and a tenderness to these questions that I always appreciate. This is a conversation about becoming more fully ourselves in relationship with one another. If you're feeling the hunger for deeper brotherhood, for deeper purpose, or if you wonder what healthy masculinity actually looks like in changing the world and in a changing world, I think you're going to find something meaningful here. Welcome to the Mankind Podcast. Hey, everybody, it's Boysen Hodgson. Welcome back to the Mankind Podcast, the show where we are constantly breaking the molds of modern manhood to prove that there is more than one way to be a man. Today, we have a return guest to the show, MacKenzie from the Mythic Masculine. Ian, first say hello.
Good to be here, Boysen.
This dude, I will say, I have projected all kinds of things onto this dude for years, and I'm just going to try. I haven't told him anything, but like I project onto this guy like incredible wisdom, incredible intelligence, incredible like longevity in terms of the understandings that he brings, incredible number of like wildly powerful mentors and teachers who he's been working with over time. You know, I'm calling these all projections. They're also kind of data on some level. But MacKenzie, let me read. MacKenzie is a filmmaker, mythosomatic guide, and the founder of the Mythic Masculine, a platform devoted to stewarding the soul work of men. For 2 decades, Ian has tracked the emergence of imaginal culture, from the fires of Burning Man to the streets of Occupy Wall Street, amplifying the voices of visionaries, artists, and wisdom keepers working toward a more regenerative world. A 15-year scholar of the Orphan Wisdom School and a 4-time pilgrim to the Tamara Peace Research Community in Portugal, he has dedicated himself to expanding the terrain of what men's inner work can be, weaving ritual, ancestral story, and somatic reclamation into a living path towards sovereign purpose. He's the co-director of the Village of Lovers, as well as Lost Nation Road, Amplify Her, and Sacred Economics. So, and I think it was probably through film that I first ran into you. But let's first go back into your story. So like we have an overlap with the New Warrior Training Adventure and the Mankind Project. So give me a little bit of history just to set a frame.
Yeah, thanks, Boysen. Well, I was drawn initially, like many, through Iron John, of course. And I encountered that book was actually in the study of my grandfather, my maternal grandfather, after he died. And he was a very kind of mysterious figure in my life when I was growing up. He was mostly absent. I just heard stories about him. He was sort of off, seeking. He was a philosopher, and I eventually sought him out actually when I was in my early 20s. I sort of went on this quest actually to find him. He was in the interior BC, and we met, and I was pretty amazed actually. He was a very interesting guy, but reclusive in certain ways, but seeking the edges. And we kindled a relationship that was off and on beyond that until he ended up dying in 2015. And it was around that time as well that I'd been a filmmaker, so I'd been exploring all these other edges, Burning Man, Occupy Wall Street, and everything. And this focus or curiosity around quote men's work in myth, I'd first encountered archetypal understandings through my work on a film called Amplify Her, which you just read, which is actually about women in electronic music. So that I actually came through the gateway of Marion Woodman and like the kind of feminine archetypal realm. And it was, it's interesting to note now that it was through that journey of understanding the feminine or trying to, I suddenly was like, oh, wait, what about the masculine? What actually it sort of wasn't the most obvious thing to explore until I had some further relational troubles and kind of edges that were being pushed in relationship. At that time as well, I went to Tamara, which you also named, which is this radical research project, ended up being the focus of the Village of Lovers. And so men's work and mythopoetics was sort of, starting to tremble below the surface for me. And when I went to my grandfather's study after he died, in his, he was, he had tons of books on everything, philosophy, metaphysics, and religion. And in his back study, as I was there with his son, my uncle, we were gathering things up and organizing his stuff. There was Iron John just sitting on this pile, like in the middle of this room. It felt like, maybe a shaft of light was coming through, like Indiana Jones or something. It just felt like there was some mythic thing. I'd heard about the book, but I never really saw it until boom, it was right there. And so of course I picked it up and I read it. And like many men listening probably found a way of being recognized, or they recognized themselves in the story, in the mythic realm that Bly so eloquently illuminated. And I had a friend also around that time who I think the previous year had done the MKP NWTA training. And he had started to really enter that realm. And, I think he was maybe staffed at that point as well. And he was like, hey man, like any of the men that get lit up, he's like, you should consider this, might be for you. And I resisted because I also felt there was an edge there for me that, was mysterious, but I knew I needed to explore. So eventually, I signed up, I said yes, and did the training. It was October here in Vancouver, West Coast region of 2016. Yeah, 2016, and went through that training. And it moved me, there was a lot there, certainly, that inspired me, that challenged me. But overall, how I'd frame it is that it sort of reconnected a core trust in men that I didn't know. That I didn't know I was missing, right? I didn't know I was missing until I actually experienced it there. And so from then on, it was like, the fire was lit. And also the curiosity about, of course, Iron John shows up in that weekend. As well as different themes around sexuality and shadow work. And, I knew, I was like, okay, this is the beginning of a longer inquiry, and it's continued to roll on from there.
Thank you. And in that, so there's a kind of microcosm for yours. One of the things that I've noticed that you've been doing over the last couple of years with the Mythic Masculine is kind of expanding the ends out to go deeper into the kind of mythopoetic men's work history and kind of diving into that. So talk a little bit more around the exploration that it's led you to.
Mm-hmm. Well, I knew as I made contact with the weekend and again, the story and the archetypal dimensions, I got very curious, because then I started looking into the history and I'm like, where's this been? I was 35 at the time, which is also a mythic number that Bly speaks to, going back to the Wild Man's Cage. And I was like, what happened? Like, how did I not hear about this until now? And those listening may have also recognized, I do think there's a renaissance of this work happening. But it actually was underground for a time. And I spoke to Michael Meade, of course, who's a titan in this scene, as well as Martin Shaw, who I've now become collaborators with. And Martin Shaw, the great storyteller. He's more of a bridge figure, of course, because he worked directly with Bly. He spent a lot of time in the men's scene, but he also comes from a different soil. He comes from the UK and really steeped in a kind of old time, Shanachie is what the term is, a kind of griot storyteller. So he acts as a bridge, though, because he has incredible stories of that time, but he also, again, isn't coming from a North American context. And so he could explain a lot to me in the history. And so I just started to understand, like, oh, this was part of a real groundswell that began, probably around the 70s, if you wanted to pinpoint at least that generational, movement. I sought Bill Koth to interview him as well about the history of MKP. I know it was initially called the Wild Man Weekend, and that they wrote Bly around that time, himself and the trio. And they said, if I remember correctly, a sense of, hey, we did this great weekend, the Wild Man Weekend. And Bly wrote back, say, great, but don't call it the Wild Man Weekend. And how that's, continued to evolve there. And so I started to really sense, like, oh, there was this really powerful swell of interest around this, men gathering in the hundreds and thousands, and then it had to kind of go through a necessary reckoning around bigger questions, cultural appropriation and and lineage and I don't know, reconnecting it to a wider lens than just sort of personal wellness, right? Which is, I think, is still what we're undergoing now. Like, what does it mean to bind it to actual cultural regeneration work, rather than lads getting together for a weekend and then going back to a soul-destroying, planet-crushing system. So all of these things, were big. And for me in the podcast, I thought, hey, this is a great platform to seek out these folks, as well as voices that aren't heard from as much, but also have a lot to say around masculinity and culture work and animism and myth. And so that's really what the journey has been with the podcast, doing my best to stitch the generations as well, because with this renaissance, I think there's a lot of newer, younger, upstart kind of men and organizations coming up, and it's important that they don't feel that they're inventing everything, that there's an actual lineage, there's learnings, there's mentorship that needs to be transmitted. It's the old dance between the puer and the senex, and a little too much puer and they float away into the ether, but a little too much senex and it's just curmudgeonly and too caught in their own tradition. And so we need to have that dance. And so the podcast in many ways has been my best attempt to serve that.
Thank you. I think that what you said is the kind of reckoning. I did the New Warrior Training Adventure in 2004. I was 33 years old when I went through the New Warrior Training Adventure. So right around that kind of early midlife. And I think that I represented, I was a Gen Xer, and in the emergence of Gen X into the movement, into men's work. And I think that I've watched over the last 20 years this kind of, okay, how do we understand this? How do we understand this thing that we love and we find beautiful and we find heart connecting and heart opening, and the rhythm of the drum is in my, it's in my bones these days, and the storytelling is in my bones these days, and there's this world out there. So what are you seeing, or what have you been learning about how we can, right? Like, I remember watching clips from the your Wall Street film and thinking, okay, how do we frame this with systems that are really built to not help, not care for, not be for human beings, with this thing that is essentially like soul loving and human.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. It's a big question. I mean, it'd be
helpful.
Question. Yeah. It'd be helpful if I can have a bit of a wingspan on this too, so I can do it justice.
Yeah.
But I think that, so my film work was largely around this question of how did we get where we are? Right?
Yeah.
That was sort of what I continued to try to explore. I'm a millennial, pretty I think, clearly. And, graduated high school in 99, right on the cusp of, this new millennium. And I think that I also had that reckoning with understanding the kind of built-in finitude of the systems, that whether we're talking about, peak oil or ecological breakdown, I was like, oh, this is like existential threat level reality that we're in, which has only continued to intensify since then. And so I tried to understand largely through film of like, how did we get here? What are the kind of forces and the what are we in the wake of? And that took me to places like Occupy Wall Street, which I would say were attempts at, I mean, there was a great, I think it was Matt Talubi, the journalist at the time, who wrote something like, this was the first time that folks had gone on strike from their own culture, which I kind of like love that phrase.
Love it.
Sort of collective sense of like, wait a second, this isn't where we're wanting to go, for a lot of people. And they're like, we're going to go on strike and see if we can create a pocket of possibility to see actually what kind of imaginal, pathways might emerge. And I think Michael Meade has a beautiful passage. It might be The World Behind the World, but there's something around holding the tension between opposites and how important that is. Stephen Jenkinson, who I'll probably touch on in a moment, he speaks about this idea of the skill of ambivalence, which is, usually means to most folks are kind of like, meh, like to be ambivalent, but he upholds that to be, I think, similar to what Meade would say, of to be ambivalent, to be able to hold multiple possibilities without collapsing them into, oh, it has to be this or that. Because when you can hold the tension, something new can emerge, from that portal. And so I feel like Occupy Wall Street, and there's been other movements since then that have tried to create what also sometimes are known as TAZ, temporary autonomous zones, right? Tahrir Square in Egypt around the fall of the regime as well. There was known to be a temporary autonomous zone. In some ways, Burning Man is as well, but of course it's been largely infiltrated by the tech bro, oligarchy and all that stuff too. But there's a power in that kind of imaginal realms that we can create. And so what I saw there also was a kind of unexpected rekindling of the memory of village. That's what I would say.
Thank you. Great.
Yeah.
Yes.
It was kind of like people would say, wow, suddenly, we were interacting with each other in ways that felt, unfamiliar yet familiar, ancestral even, of ways of being together, of mutual care and, trust. And so to me, that was like, oh, that was an encounter of a kind of experience. And so people from the outside who saw it as like, oh, they're hippies that don't know what they want. And, like, why are they wasting time? And they didn't understand it from the inside. And a lot of judgment, was railed against them for that reason. And again, even since, people say, what do they accomplish? And again, they're kind of misinterpreting, actually, I think, what was that actual imaginal possibility that a lot of people touched and affected people to the extent that, like me, continued to kind of carry that forward in different ways. I think it was maybe Michael White, he's one of the co-founders of Occupy, said something like, it shattered into 1,000 shards of light, right? And that have continued to emerge in different ways. So I followed that path, and I encountered Stephen Jenkinson, who some folks may know now, who
look him up if you haven't seen him. If you haven't listened to Stephen Jenkinson, just look him up.
Yeah, I have good fortune of meeting him in 2012, and in a sense, been, they call them scholars in the school, rather than students, they're scholars, and been under his masterful apprenticeship for 16 years now. Affected me a lot around what is village mindedness, actually, like as a skill, actually as a certain skill, as well as an animistic understanding of what is ritual, what is ceremony, what's it for, what's culture for. And then, of course, Tamara, this community in Portugal, where I was invited to make a film along with a couple other filmmakers, which to me, again, they're a radical peace project, but at the same time, they're probably in some ways the most kind of resuscitated encounter of village in a European context that I'd known was possible. Because again, a lot of folks who may be hearing this, right, are from North America, or don't have any lived experience of what it means to be in village. That it's easier to see, like, I don't know, a tribe in Papua New Guinea or something, right, and say like, oh, right, that's what that is.
That over there, yeah.
But us as with this skin tone, like we don't have that, and we never did. And yet this encounter can kindle again an ancestral memory, I think, of that. Actually, for most of human history, this is actually how we lived. And it's only very recently we're living this kind of modern experiment called kind of capitalism modernity, which is very abnormal, actually, right? Like from, again, what most of us have experienced for a long, long time. And so to me, all of that kind of hit me as the sense that this is the crater in which everything else is happening within. So if we understand men's work, it's happening in the crater of the loss of village, right? In particular, North Americans who left a lot from Europe and don't have those lineages anymore intact at all. We have sort of vague allegations, right? And so it's not to criticize the impulse to try to resuscitate these ways of being together, in particular in spaces like culture work, men's work. But it's just important to have a contextual understanding of how we got there, actually, and why there's such an impulse to borrow, I'll use euphemistically, from cultures that appear more intact, like indigenous folks in here in North America. And it's understandable because it's the closest approximation that a lot of folks who have no lived experience anymore are like, oh, this feels real, this feels ceremonial, this feels spiritually nourishing, which it is, but it also belongs to other people, right? So it's like, how do we actually reach back into our own lineages authentically and actually recreate in a new time these kinds of things? So that's really the lens that I'm bringing now into this understanding. And as Stephen would say, it's a kind of poverty, but that poverty is not nothing, right? He always recommends, he's like, just start with the poverty. Don't start with the lunging at.
Exactly.
Right? Yeah. Don't start with lunging at what looks good and taking it, because you're missing actually that starting with the poverty is actually important. And if we're talking about rites of passage, if we're talking about men's work, and actually reorienting away from a kind of focus only on personal wellness or personal growth.
Yes.
Right. Which is not just men's work, of course. Any psychedelics and wellness, things, they're inevitably caught in the wake of a kind of consumer capitalist paradigm. And so it's like, how do we salvage the kernels of these from the jaws of that impulse? Is a continual edge, again, because I say, I have offerings that I do.
Yes.
I have retreats, I have stuff, MKP, you might need to sustain itself, but it's like, how do we walk that edge? And it's a tough one.
So much in there. I'm thinking intersections and overlays. So within this crater, that where it is all kind of existing, I think it is easy, and I've witnessed this around me, and I've experienced this and been part of it also. It's real easy to say, oh, I just want my world to look like this, and start setting up barriers, which I think it's a spiritual bypass, really, that it's very easy to fall into, of saying, no, this is separate from this, and therefore I'm rejecting and no longer existing in all of the other frameworks and intersections that we all are living in and living through, right? Where am I going with this? So I have a link
though, by the way. Yeah, I have a link. I mean, I could link it to the manosphere stuff too, if you want to. There, but
I think we will go in. Yeah, we're definitely going to talk about the manosphere, but I'm trying to understand, and I think that this work is being done out there in some of the other cultural spaces and other research spaces, where it's like, okay, how can we understand our culture? How can we understand village? How can we understand connection? And also not be in denial about or trying to push away the realities of all the systems that are impacting us, of power dynamics, of capitalism, of all the kinds of political movements and political realities that have shaped us, that do shape us, right? And understanding men as intersections and overlays of all of these things make up what it means to be a man today, right? And
Mm-hmm.
we can tease them apart.
Well, you just made me realize or remember a conversation that I had with Bayo Komolafe, who's fantastic poet.
Again, yes. Look him up. Yes.
Yeah, and Bayo, I believe in our conversation, this is a number of years ago now, but I think we arrived at this understanding of that masculinity could be understood as a strategy.
Yes.
As a strategy. It's a contextual strategy rather than a kind of biological certainty or universal. Yeah. And so I think it's helpful to understand here, because one of the questions that often, arises in particularly men's spaces of all sorts and feminist spaces and, right wing, left wing is what is masculinity? Is there a true and right masculinity?
Right.
It's like as if there's some kind of universal to defend and sort of uphold. And I think that
go back to
exactly the traditional men, when men were men, and and at the same time, of course, there's a lot of kind of trickster emergent ways of understanding being men from non-binary folk, from trans men, for example, that are actually offering, I think, really important additional layers to what it means, quote, to be a man. But I just want to say that for me, what I've arrived at is a sense that, well, one, masculinity is diverse, but also, like Bayo says, masculinity is a strategy. So it's a contextual strategy that is inherently related to the context in which, let's say, a man is trying to man, if we use a verb to there.
Nice. Man. Yes. A man who is trying to man. Yes.
Yeah. And so it's inherently shaped basically by our cultural norms, expectations. And it's not unimportant, if I could say. It's not unimportant. It is important to see, I think, the structures of society and power that many of us probably listening exist in, or what Rian Eisler, who wrote the book Chalice and the Blade, would call domination culture.
Yes.
Right. So the subtle and overt forms of domination, which is basically like we must do this or else. Right. And so from, some may call it patriarchy, and I think there's value in that in certain ways, but there's a lot of nuance there that gets lost, or a lot of defense that rises. When people say, what? Like, you're saying we don't need strong men, or we don't need good fathers.
Right.
Like, and it's like, okay.
No, we're not saying that.
Yeah. Just ease up for a moment. But Rian's language, I think, can be helpful, at least to offer that nuance, that we're talking about actually structures of domination and hierarchy, which is where we get to the manosphere. And for me, why I see them, this is important to see within a wider kind of energetic context, which is that I believe the feminism, and again, it's good to understand it in a diverse way. There's feminisms, there's not a monolith called everyone agrees that feminism, understands this. And so
all the head nodding, our listeners can't see all the head nodding and grinning that's going on in here, but I just want to underline. Yes. Feminisms, masculinities, like multiple ways of understanding, multiple timelines, multiple histories, multiple perspectives, multiple authors. Right. Yes.
Yeah.
Right.
And Sophie Strand, a friend and colleague, she wrote The Flowering Wand. She would say that's a polyphony.
Actually, another unbelievable book.
We need a polyphony of masculinities as opposed to a polyphony of femininities. And it's, I think, important to understand, like, why would feminism arise as a cultural movement, as a response, as in feminism just didn't arrive out of a vacuum. It wasn't like women were fine and men were doing great, and just feminism arose because some women decided to hate men. Like, as in, really, when you unpack it, you're like, okay, it's actually responding to things. Like, there's an actual real power differential, or often sexual trauma or abuse, like all of these things that women have been subject to for a very long time. That feminism arose as a response to try to send the message, really, to call it the patriarchal kings of, like, hey, this doesn't work for us. Like, things have to change, actually. Look at what's going on to, the social fabric, to children, to the biosphere. And so I think at the same time, there's a lot of buried or emerging rage, right? Emerging, take your power back. And I'm talking about the 70s now, right? A kind of bra burning and, all that kind of stuff. So Bill Koth, when I interviewed him, he spoke to this too, him growing up, or at least being active in those years. He felt there was a gauntlet thrown down to the men from the women at the time, being like, so what are you going to do? We're stepping up here. We're like, are you going to meet us, kind of thing? And he was like, oh shit, we got to do something about it. And that was one of the impulses behind the Wild Man Weekend, all that stuff. But I think there was a branches of response from men, if we're talking about modern masculinity in the West. And one of those branches was the men's rights movement.
Yeah.
Right. And it continues to this day. But I think that's really good, because the men's rights to me is the DNA of the manosphere. And I would say men's rights, there is appropriate concern and trouble around how men also suffer within, the social, consequences of,
social and legal and
social systems
frameworks.
Yes. And isolation and loneliness and suicide. Of course, these are all like very real things. There's kernels of truth there. But if the underlying response to that, to feminism is the problem, right? As in, things were great except for the feminism, that otherwise, men would be back on top or something, or wouldn't feel subject to, all of the other negative consequences. So it's important to be able to discern those two. So, but one became the men's rights, I think, thread, and the other became the mythopoetic. Which was what Bly was responding to, I think, as well, right? Recognizing, again, this cultural poverty. And in particular, I think of men lacking spaces to be more expressive, more embodied, to grieve together, right? Yes. And, it was Stephen Jenkinson who so beautifully rendered this understanding that if a people in a culture are unable to grieve as a skill, they have grievance instead. Right? If they can't grieve, they have grievance. And so, and if people are saying, like, what, unpack it a little bit, it's just to say that this to me is also the fundament of the manosphere. And in particular, you saw it very clearly in the film, the recent documentary on Netflix, where there was a kind of, deeply anxious kind of programs running under the men that I saw, which was this need to constantly assert their dominance, right? And to denigrate women, or to denigrate, the matrix and the system, of which has very real consequences on them, right? A lot of these boys growing up with the absent father, or fathers that were domineering, right? Again, or abusive. And so their response to that very pain and lots of grief, no doubt, is to basically get better at the exact same system that abused and dominated them.
Right.
To exploit others, to come out on top. Again, which is it's an understandable response, right, to a hierarchical domination system. It's like, well, I'm going to be on, the top of the other guys. That's the only way to feel safe in that system, rather than understanding it's the system itself that is actually perpetuating the same cycles of essentially abuse and trauma. And so I see with the lost, like we'll call them the lost boys of the manosphere, is actually the lack of village that would have properly gathered these boys in, offered them proper initiatory rights, adult figures, not just their parents or the absent parents, to help mentor, to steward, to hold. They would have grown up very differently. It would have been very different men. And yet, of course, this is what we have instead. And so again, it's like, what happens if we have a culture that doesn't do rites of passage, doesn't really have mentorship in villages? It's like, that's the manosphere. As it's sort of most clearly metastasized expression of that thing, which is beyond any of the individuals in that, whether it's Andrew Tate or whatever. Andrew Tate is just the uber alpha archetype of that same consequence of the cultural poverty that we've been speaking to. So I'll pause there.
Yes, learning to exist and succeed in a sick system doesn't mean you're healthy.
Krishnamurti. Yeah.
Right. There you go. And it seems to me that a lot of this occurs in in a culture, in a society where so many of the influences and so many of the things that are impacting men who get drawn into these ways of being, there's a healthy longings for. There's healthy longings for village. There's healthy longings for health. There's healthy longings to be a man who is capable of providing and sustaining, and not only himself but others around him. And then there is an economic system that's going to pick him up and put him on a treadmill. And if you can't understand something in your world as a commodity that you need to trade, as a tool that you need to use, or that is an artifact that you have to have and possess, including other human beings, including women, right? Then that is the only kind of frame for manning. As you turn it into, right, that's your only context. That is the only strategy that you can pull together. So what we're presenting, and I think in our pre-conversation, you said that mythopoetics in some way, in some evolving way, provides an antidote, provides a salve for this. So talk more about how we can be the salve in this hurting world.
Yeah, beautiful. Now, I think one of the primary functions of myth, and by myth now, of course, we're speaking of mythology, not myth as the opposite of fact, as in something that isn't true. So what is the function of myth? There's multiple understandings of this as far as I know. One of the functions is psychological illumination. And this is often where, of course, the Jungian influence, that psychology, that's where it goes. Marie-Louise von Franz, of course, Bly's sort of predecessor. And then, of course, Bly with Iron John, turning Iron John into a story around masculine initiation, or an initiation tale. And that's profound to be able to have done that work, and for men to find themselves in it, as I did, and to provide a mythic map, a context in which to understand my experience of being a man and my life journey, and ways of working with different energies. Right now, we're also bringing in King, War, Magician, Lover as one particularly popular map that also
one
caught
frame,
fire.
yeah.
And how useful that can be for a man to have that, discerning these energies within his inner landscape. The king, the warrior, the magician, the lover. I mean, these are powerful, and that's just one layer of understanding the function of myth. And an older function of myth, probably my understanding through folks like Martin Shaw has spoken eloquently, and particularly other indigenous guests, understand myth as actually coming from the land itself. So that myths are not human in origin, but they're a way of understanding a kind of greater cosmology, sometimes even like original instructions, as indigenous folks may say, of how to be somewhere, right? How to be in a place in a reciprocal, respectful way. And so there's an older understanding of Iron John, which actually I have a beautiful conversation around it with this mythologist colleague of mine, Stephanie Mackay, who studied with Martine Prechtel, who illuminates Iron John as an older understanding of actually it's about literally iron. It's about a kind of courtship relationship with iron, the element iron, and like retrieving it from a bog, and actually the kind of reciprocal relationship that would be required in order to be in an animate world, right? And by animism, we don't hear that word too often. Stephen Jenkinson has this really great riff on it. What he says, it properly so. Every culture ever has been animate, meaning, or they practice animism, meaning everything has a spirit, right? Everything has a spirit. Everything is alive. And again, it's only very recently that we have the occurrence of what you'd call inanimism, right? Inanimism as an understanding, but nobody ever says, as a modern person, oh, I'm an inanimist, right? Like, as in we only designate, like other cultures, often indigenous cultures, they're an animist culture. But it's like, because we're the modern person is the default true, like, scientific
Right.
understanding. But it's actually more fair to say, oh, we're the inanimous, which is, again, not a common, or it didn't used to be very common. And so from that understanding, myth becomes a way of actually practicing animism, like as an actual lived relationship with all of things. And so, so I circle this to what your question is of like, how do we become Baum, in particular with the mythopoetic path? And I think a large part of it is understanding myth as a alive practice of reculturing ways of being together, ways of being with place, and recognizing that it's only through ways of being together that village, also as a verb, to village, has a chance to appear. Because when we're in our own nuclear bubbles, as so many of us are, there's, I used to be in a suburb, a long time ago, and I tried to get, quote, community to arrive through potlucks, right? I was like, let's get together for potlucks. And we had a few folks come out, but mostly people didn't. Mostly they're busy. Mostly they don't need each other, actually.
Right.
And Charles Eisenstein, in my short film from way back too, Sacred Economics, he talks about this. He said, most of us understand, we don't call it this, but most of us only really experience what he calls shared consumption.
Yes.
Shared, right? I mean, men too, go to a football game, go to the bar.
Yes.
Play golf together. It's like, cool. Those can be fun. It's like, but a lot of guys probably who found their way here to MKP discovered or felt there must be something more. There must be something deeper. And so stepping into shared culture work together is the response that I think both, so many men are longing for, but also is the response that the world needs right now. And I'll give one more example of this. So a lot of talk, it goes around rites of passage, right? Particularly for younger men. And I myself, I've been involved in sort of different, I wouldn't call myself at all deeply involved in this or experienced in this terrain. I have other colleagues that are, they run organizations for young men. But from my understanding of how I've showed up in different moments and from the work that they do, that to be able to pull off ceremonies like this, rites of passage like this, it requires more than just, airdropping everyone together on a weekend, right? And like trying to do something and then leaving and going back to life, because properly what it does is reconfigure the landscape of the entire ecology of folks who are coming together to do this, not just the young boys, but their dads as well, to be called into service, right? To properly pull these kinds of things off. And the beautiful architecture of this is that as a father, I have a 7-year-old boy, right? So I'm of course thinking about this, and around 13, 14 typically is, the time frame for these kinds of things that is important to occur. I've been building relationships with other men since before he was born. That right I'm doing my best to tend to arrive at that point, at say 13, 14, where maybe him and some other boys are taken out to the wild in some fashion, appropriately, where I'm not involved as his father, because I'm disqualified actually from my role because I'm his father. Like the parental transaction, that dynamic is just, it short circuits the thing. It's not meant to be, but that means that I can be that to my men's sons.
Yeah,
exactly. I can support that. So you realize, oh, there's like a need to begin weaving and trust building. And, so it's not just this. And then you start to realize, oh, at the, baby blessing of so-and-so's, being born, or the father blessing, which is becoming more, ideally more common. Women get blessed up as they should when, the child is coming, but also father blessing, properly getting them ready for that, to marriage itself, like what are the ways in which ritual begins to show up in the actual procession of life and deaths, of course, death of a parent often. Right? I've been involved with other men too who've navigated that threshold, what's required at these moments. And so you realize there's this tapestry that starts to unfold where, your life just becomes, again, fully reconfigured around actually these things rather than, life and capitalism and trying to get by. And then this on the side, right? As in, that's actually not possible even but it's actually not what we're even longing for, I think. Like, I think we long to be reconfigured actually into a greater cosmology of being with each other. And I think the mythopoetic path has that promise within it, as long as it's, again, not just a weekend, once a year or something, that it actually starts to show up, right, in other areas, other thresholds, other moments where village can appear.
Because we can slide sideways into the ditch of even this rite of passage experience, even this kind of mytho work, being consumptive.
Totally.
Being we are doing shared consumption instead of, I love that you brought in the idea of tapestry, and that's exactly what was occurring to me as you were speaking. In the way that we have staged our society, every move of passage into something is supposed to make you more capable of being a transactional enactor in the world. You just get better at transactions. We're kind of saying, nope, you don't get to be more independent. Every rite of passage ties you to more people. Every rite of passage ties you to more responsibility. Every rite of passage ties you to more threads wider in the world than you had before. And that's actually terrifying on some level, because now I'm responsible to it. Now I'm accountable to all of these threads that I'm attaching myself to my friends, the brothers who I sit in circle with, to their kids.
Yeah. And I would call it consequential. Yeah. You realize, oh, I'm consequential. Your presence is consequential, and so is your absence, in failing to show up for duty.
Yes.
Yeah. Well, this may be a good shift too, as well. I mean, I know we're sort of winding down, but into sort of the latest evolution or effort, at least, from my end, as well as my collaborator, Trevor Mervyn, here in the West Coast of Canada, that we've been inspired through this work, but also in particular through the Minnesota Men's Conference, which I had the honor of going to attend back about a year and a half ago. It was their 40th anniversary. And it was started by Robert Bly, again, the good man, and really has been just kind of cooking away there, which, I'd heard about it here and there. And then when the 40th anniversary came up, I was like, man, I got to go. So I spoke with Walton Stanley, one of the principals, and, I was able to attend. And it was incredible, actually, because one, it's in Minnesota, which is, again, a kind of, hallowed ground for, us here on the West Coast, but it's also where Bly's grave is.
Yes.
Right. He's buried there. And I actually had the great honor of going to his grave, seeing his tombstone, which is pretty brilliant, actually. It's quite a large tombstone. It's got a Sufi symbol on it. And I was accompanied by a fellow named Jonathan Stensland, who is sort of a godson to Bly and his wife, Ruth. And Jonathan actually he shared, this is the kind of mythic encounter for me, was talking to Jonathan, who's now in his, I think, late 50s. But he used to type up Iron John for Bly. Like, Bly would send him, handwritten pages, or like cut up, sequences, and be like, hey, type this up. And, they talk about it over tea or coffee in the mornings. He's this young kid, and Bly's like, what do you think about this? And, get his feedback, and we'll work on it. And being able to hear those kind of stories was just a complete delight for me. And the Minnesota group itself has been, again, going for 40 years now. Yeah. And it was amazing, actually, to be around so many gray-haired men in this work, because, again, there's a renaissance now. There's a lot of youngers coming up who, have a lot of chutzpah. And there's something about steeping with these older men at it for decades now. And the kind of, I would call it like the tone of how they were together with each other, which was tender often, which was loving, fierce, poetic, all of these qualities which affected me significantly. And it was a mix of, lectures and myth telling. They told Iron John, actually, again, which was, a delight. And they've built a beautiful library of actually talks on YouTube, if men want to go check it out.
Yes.
With Martine Prechtel and Malidoma Somé and Michael Meade and Robert Moore. And there's an amazing library of these talks. And so myself and Trevor, we really sat with what felt, holding the embers of what they'd been tending over there. And this year took it upon ourselves to create really the Cascadia Men's Conference, the first ever that we're calling it here just north of Vancouver, Canada. And I'm delighted to say that at least two of the elders from Minnesota will be there, Walton Stanley and Miguel Rivera.
Beautiful.
They're going to help light it, kick it off. And it'll really be that cauldron of myth telling, ritual, men singing together, eating together, doing our best to, keep that or to plant that culture and make it alive here on the West Coast. And so, we're a few months out and lots is cooking, but it feels like it's going to be something special.
Beautiful. Cascadia Men's Conference. Look for the link in the show notes to several things that we've been talking about here today. So now what? What do you see? Are you getting any glimpses or hints at where we're headed with this? Because I know that I'm aware in the space that there are a lot of things shifting. There are lots of questions, the solid ground of men's work. Even that is a discourse these days, right? With what does it mean for a Gen Alpha person, to be emerging into masculinity, femininity, manhood, womanhood. Are you seeing any fires off in the distance that you're tracking?
Yeah. I mean, I just completed, as of this recording of our conversation, I just completed publishing a new series with trans men. And so it's 4 trans men of color. And that came about because there's a particular in-person event that I co-created with my colleague Deus Forte, which we deal actually with the archetype of the lover. And that includes pretty edgy, intimate kind of space with men, non-sexual, but there is an intimate element there. And at least up until that time, a fellow trans man named Emmanuel he was checking it out. Maybe he could attend because he wanted to steep in this work too. And he saw actually that at least, till then, the decision was not to include trans men. And that was particular because of the kinds of work that we do seem to require a certain genitalia, for example, both, from a sort of anatomical perspective, but also a kind of lived experience perspective. Again, so there's all these questions and nuances around it. And so he reached out because I said, and if you're trans and you want to talk about it, please do reach out. And so he did. And so he said, hey, maybe we want to talk about this more widely. And I can bring some friends of mine, is what he said. And I said, great, let's do it. And so the series came about. And it's a fascinating sort of open conversation around so many of these threads that, again, are illuminating for me as much as I've been trying to track, what is at the edge of the edge. And actually, what is the medicine that this trans masculinity trans men are bringing? Because I do think there's something around the rigidity or the certainty around things like that biology only determines not just, what is a man, but who is granted the stewardship of masculinity.
Yes.
That's how I would say, right? Yeah. It's like, and is that actually what we need right now? Right. And I don't really have answers, but the conversation itself is a really powerful inquiry into this, because I do think there's some other third way, right? Again, this tension between opposites that we spoke to earlier with Meade's words, that it's not one or the other. It's like, there's no such thing as, biological gender. It doesn't matter at all. It's all a social construct. Everything is up for, personalized interpretation. I don't think it's that, but it's also not the opposite, which is that, this is the way men should be. And
only
this is what manhood is. And it's like, there's some other more interesting pathway emerging, I think, that is actually offering, it's like going from 2 dimensions to 3 or 5, maybe, that there's some way of actually, like the systems, the binary itself is just clearly, no longer suitable. It's no longer functional in the way that it may have been to a degree in the past. And so I think what's actually asking to emerge is a multidimensional framework of much more possibility And this is, liberating, I think, for what we call
Yes.
cis men, right? Men that have
Yes.
been assigned the gender that this feels true for them. But also for men that, like Emmanuel, trans man, who's actually wanting to experience more like this mythopoetic lineage, and has often found himself shut out from it, again, because of
Yes.
this criteria. And so I'm more always interested in, imaginal possibility, just as a disposition. And so even as much as I'm challenged, and I am, by trying to understand these frameworks and possibilities, I still feel ultimately that's what life I wants, actually. Well, life wants more life, more diversity, more possibility.
That was all very beautifully said. Yeah, I love that. Yeah, and what occurs to me and keeps occurring to me in many of these conversations where I feel challenged, where I feel confused, where things that are capital T true are getting questioned is, wow, I don't actually have to fully understand this. But isn't it really interesting and life-giving to be in the mix of the conversation and to be open to the multidimensional kind of questions? And I think for me, looking at kind of the life of the mythopoetic since the 70s, I think that this is another step in kind of creating discourse, right? Like myth as text, right? And text is subject to interpretation, and these interpretations get rung through systems that are currently going on, right? And how the stories get told. So I think we're living through a time right now where all of the ancient analysis of previous cultures that was done mostly primarily by white Western men is now being looked at and said, Graeber and Wengrow are looking at it and saying, maybe that's not the whole story here. Maybe there's other ways of imagining this. Maybe there's other animating factors that Earth is trying to reveal to us these days. And if I am open enough to listening to what's emergent, then what kind of village could we have together, I think.
Yeah. Amen.
So check out the Cascadia Men's Conference. I feel so grateful, and I certainly remember the last times that we've been in conversations. This is how I leave the conversation, feeling like, oh yeah, like, good, juicy, big stuff. Ian MacKenzie, you're a gift. Thank you very much for bringing yourself to the podcast. And I'll give you the closing words. What's left?
Well, if men are lit up by this and curious, they're welcome to check out themythicmasculine.com, of course. There's a link to my podcast. Also, it's hosted on Substack. If you're familiar, you can find it also on Spotify, all that stuff. So lots of conversations there. There's an archive of all these folks: Bayo Komolafe, Sophie Strand, Rian Eisler, Bill Koth. They're all there. And as far as men also maybe want to take a deeper dive with me, there are in-person events I hold here on the West Coast, but online, which is accessible from anywhere, of course, is The Deep Masculine, which is my best response, I think, to both what was kindled in me at the New Warrior Training Weekend, in particular with the story of Iron John, but also really on the trail, tracking the wild man to its primordial depths. And the phrase, the deep masculine, as well, comes from Bly and his understanding that, again, below the day-to-day, the modern noise, that all men have this calling to this deeper, primordial, often pre-verbal masculine, and how making contact with that, and in some ways, again, the wild man in the cage, all that stuff, right? This is all the emanations of that, but that there's some deep work there. One, for men, initially often to reclaim their relationship to the feminine, right? I see that's a lot of the work that was done in the 70s, 80s. Bly calls it the soft male. We might call it now the sensitive new age guy. but just the sense that that's important, deep work, right? Reclamation of emotional, capacity, sensitivity, tenderness, all that stuff, very important. Also to not project on a lot of those shadows onto women, of course, which is, I mean, that's really where the modern culture is stuck at, to be honest. I mean, between the recent Rape Academy, the Epstein files,
Yes.
all of that stuff, to me, that's the deep shadow of masculinity, who is unintegrated its feminine dimension. So again, lots to unpack there, but just say on the other side of that, it's work that never ends. It's just, a continual courtship. There's the deep masculine below. And so, at least for me as well, that's the framework that we've invited my colleague and I, Deus Forte, into, guiding men through 3 months of an online mythosomatic inquiry into this territory. So if men are interested, check it out online. I'd love to have you.
Ian MacKenzie, thank you. Look forward to talking to you again. And someday we'll meet in person.
Hallelujah.
Keep listening to the Mankind Podcast.
This has been the Mankind Podcast, produced in association with the Mankind Project USA. And of course, I want to thank you, the listener, because through your attention and your support, you make it a heck of a lot easier for us to let men out there in the world know that they are not alone and that there is more than one way to be a man. And if you've been enjoying the music throughout this episode and all of our episodes, check out Jim, Donovan, and the Sun King Warriors. I have links to them in the show notes. Now, the fee for this episode is simple. If you found gold and insights that you believe could benefit your loved ones and those you care about, be sure to share it with them. And of course, remember that life doesn't happen to us, it happens for us, so long as we rip the pen out of fate's hand and become the author of our own story. So my friend, pick up the pen and we'll see you next week. Lots of love.
Hey, it's Boysen. On the Mankind Podcast, we've brought some incredible guests on to talk about the importance of doing the work to improve our mental and emotional health. And here's the truth. Multiple times over the last 25 years, I've had the help of one-on-one work with some amazing therapists. For me, for my wife, for both of us as adoptive parents, and for our kids. The Mankind Project and Men's Group, though awesome, are not a substitute for professional mental health support. And so I'm thrilled that the Mankind Podcast now has BetterHelp as a sponsor for the show. BetterHelp works online. It asks you what you're working on and then matches you for live one-on-one sessions with a licensed therapist, someone trained to work with you, listen, and offer helpful insights. I'm using BetterHelp. It's super easy, and I like what I'm getting. If getting one-on-one support in the comfort of your own space feels like a good direction for you, I invite you to check it out. Go to the link in the show notes or betterhelp.com/mankind. And if you sign up, you'll get 10% off your first month of therapy.